charity within sort of the Birmingham and Solihull area that provides practical and emotional support to women and children affected by kind of violence and abuse. Our bread and butter is domestic violence, but we do also support with issues around sort of female genital mutilation, forced marriage, sort of child sexual exploitations, the kind of whole sort of range of what would fall under the violence against women and girls kind of umbrella. We've been providing this support for over 35 years. We originally, as with most kind of women's services, started out in the kind of 70s with the rise of the feminist movement as illegal squats. So we're never quite sure how old we are. We think that this might be our 40th year, but we haven't kind of quite decided because nobody really knows. We don't obviously squat kind of buildings now, although we have sort of joked that kind of austerity gets much worse. We might have to go back to our kind of radical roots in order to continue providing sort of services. And we try to provide a real kind of range of support services for women. So that includes our helpline, which isn't just there for women. Our helpline is very much there for you guys as professionals to get kind of advice and support around. We have several refuges. So we have 6 refuges, 5 in Birmingham and 1 in the Solihull area. We're the only refuge provider in Solihull. We've got a range of different kind of outreach services. We provide support to women that are heard at MARAC, so that's women kind of classed as being at high risk. And we also have an IRIS project, which is a project that works specifically with GP practices. So we train GPs, and then they ask women directly around abuse, and then they refer into us. And it was really through IRIS that we started to kind of pick up and started to work with older women. And we started to get a much higher percentage of older women accessing the service than we'd kind of ever had. We always knew that these women were out there, but hadn't ever quite been able to kind of get them. And through sort of working with the older women, we put in for some funding, and we now have a dedicated project called the Purple Project, which works specifically with women aged 55 and over. Some of it is kind of casework, some of it is training, so a bit like what I'm doing with you guys, kind of going out and delivering training. And this kind of webinar is a bit of a sort of, I suppose, a bit of a kind of taster of what the Purple Project training session is kind of like. And we also have a group work project as well. Like Rachel kind of said, one of the things that we found really, really interesting since kind of having the Purple Project is that we've really started to recognise that older women have quite different needs to the younger women that we work with in terms of kind of their end goals when kind of looking at support. They're often quite different to what sort of it is with younger women. Leaving is rarely the kind of end goal that we're sort of working towards. It's much more about kind of improving the women's quality of life. And what the group work kind of gives women is that opportunity to be with other women that have been through similar experiences and to kind of make new sort of social kind of connections. So we've learned a lot, and so we sort of really kind of want to share that knowledge with other kind of people. I should probably kind of caveat before kind of going any further. Please do ask questions as we go along. If you want to. If it's something that I know I'm going to cover, I might kind of just not raise it because I know I'm going to deal with it. If not, I will answer it. And like Rachel said, there's time at the end to ask questions. But I also wanted to kind of caveat and say that the focus of this is obviously going to be on women. I'm not really going to be referring to male victims. And when I'm talking about kind of perpetrators, I will primarily be talking about male perpetrators. The reason for this is that the clue's kind of in the name. We are Women's Aid. We only work with women, so that is our area of expertise. We do not have expertise in kind of male victims of domestic violence. But also the reality is that domestic violence is gendered by kind of nature. So we think it's really important to kind of acknowledge that. But it doesn't in any way mean that we think that men can't be victims, because they are, nor do we think that that means women can't be perpetrators, because obviously we know that they can be. But that's kind of why I'm going to primarily talk about victims as women and perpetrators as men. So as I kind of mentioned before, we sort of have learned a lot through our kind of purple project. And when we're kind of thinking about why having a focus on older women, there is a huge amount of invisibility around older women. When you look at kind of national statistics around domestic violence, most of the statistics only collect from women between the age of sort of 18 to kind of sort of 50. And it's seemingly as though women aged over 50 just don't exist. And it can actually be quite difficult to collect kind of really accurate data around women who are older and who experience kind of domestic violence. We estimate that around about, or in terms of kind of actual statistics that we can get hold of, around 120,000 women aged kind of 55 and above reported experiencing domestic violence. I think the reality is that it is much higher, but as we go through, we're going to kind of have a think about why women might not be sort of disclosing. We know that older women are less likely to kind of be aware of kind of DV services, or they might think that these are services that are not for them. Without wanting to kind of stereotype, because we've got to treat every woman as an individual, they might be less likely to be kind of tech savvy, so maybe not quite so sure kind of how to find particular sort of services, or like I said, they just don't think that we are for them. Unfortunately, kind of general attitudes that exist in society can prohibit kind of women, and I think it's really important that we're mindful of it, so that we've got that kind of professional curiosity when we're going out and working with older women. Women going to GPs with injuries can often kind of be sort of assumed to be age-related injuries. So you might sort of be talking about a woman that has a lot of falls. The question that kind of gets missed behind that is, why is she falling? Is it because somebody is pushing her? We've certainly picked that up in our work with older women, that women would constantly present at the GP and their falls would sort of be put down to, oh, your blood pressure's not quite right, or you're in your 80s. And she said the bit nobody ever asked her was, but how did it happen? And had they asked, she would have told them that she'd been pushed on multiple kind of occasions. We know that because we're dealing with an older age bracket, that her abuser may also be seen as vulnerable, and that acknowledgement that he is vulnerable then kind of clouds professionals' capacity to recognise that he's still capable of abusing her, particularly when it comes to emotional abuse and coercive control. He might not be able to hit her anymore, but he can still abuse her in a myriad of kind of other ways. Or there is an assumption that because he's old, he can't pose any kind of physical threat, when we know that that's not the case. I was speaking to a woman just a couple of weeks ago who her abuser was her husband. She had lived with over 40 years of domestic violence, had never told anybody about it, had always kind of kept quiet. She said that he was very ill. She said he was constantly in and out of hospital. He had carers coming to the house. she said to kind of to look at him, she said you wouldn't think that he had any kind of strength at all. And she was phoning up because the night before he'd strangled her to the point that she nearly passed out. But she found kind of talking about it very difficult because she was worried that the perceptions around him, because he was old and ill, would really kind of affect how much professionals would believe her in terms of her kind of experience. Some of you also might be aware of something known as caregiver syndrome. So caregiver syndrome is something, for anyone that doesn't know, it's a kind of recognised kind of symptom for people that are carers, where they might kind of quote unquote sort of snap a little bit, and they can become extremely stressed. They might lash out at the person they're caring for. They can display kind of very volatile moods, up and down, quite angry. And sometimes the assumption is made that the woman is suffering from caregiver syndrome rather than kind of unpicking sort of the kind of the long-term dynamics of the relationship. And what that means is that the DV is not recorded. So again, she's kind of missing and invisible from the statistics. But also that she's then not given the appropriate DV support. And we know that when women are not given the appropriate support, they tend to kind of back away, and they tend to stop kind of telling their story because it feels quite pointless for them. We also know that one of the common tactics of abuse is that perpetrators will kind of tell women, that nobody will believe her, that people will think she's the one with the problem, that she's the one that needs fixing or correcting. So if she's kind of talking about her moods and the assumption is made, oh, it's caregiver syndrome, it effectively reinforces the abuse that he's kind of given her, that the problem lies with her, rather than acknowledging that the problem is with him, and she may be reacting to 30, 40 years of violence and abuse. So I've got a little bit of a quiz to just kind of pop your answers into the chat box. Elder abuse is the same as domestic violence. Do you think that's true or false? Anyone? Okay, so I'll wait a minute. Yeah. So actually, it's false. There is a difference between elder abuse and domestic violence. So elder abuse is primarily abuse that is perpetrated by either a stranger or somebody that the woman is not intimately connected to. So it could be a carer, it could be a neighbour, it could be somebody knocking on the door. So it's abuse. It can take similar forms in terms of physical abuse, financial abuse, sexual abuse, but she doesn't have an intimate kind of connection. Whereas domestic violence always has some sort of intimate connection. So either it's a family member or a current or former partner. So that's the key kind of difference. And from our perspective, it's really important to have a distinction between elder abuse and domestic violence, because the way that you're going to deal with it is going to be very different if it's a carer from an agency doing the abuse versus her son or her husband. Well, that was silly. I've answered the question myself. Anyway, older women only experience domestic violence from their partner or spouse. See if you've been listening. Yes, it is. It is false. any intimate connection. So it could be son, daughter, grandchild, brother, sister, mum, dad, cousin, or partner or spouse. Doesn't matter as long as it's kind of what we would define as an intimate kind of connection. Have a guess with this one. From recent figures, what percentage of women killed by a current or former partner were aged over 66? Got 15. Any from 15, 35? Okay, yeah. Some 6. What did I say? 45. So, 40. You're all going for very high figures. So thankfully, it's not quite as high as that. It's around about 11% of women aged 66 or over are killed by a current or former partner. What this maybe doesn't take into account of, and statistics around death and domestic violence don't, is things like suicide. So we estimate that 1 in 4 suicide attempts in women is a consequence of violence and abuse that they're experiencing. So it's a kind of response to the trauma. We don't know how many older women that die by suicide have lived with violence and abuse, because of course it's unlikely that he's going to kind of tell anybody. I think we also have to be kind of mindful of certain health conditions. So if women are having heart attacks, that we know that stress is a risk factor. And a lifetime of living with violence and abuse is going to cause kind of immense sort of stress. So there are cases where perhaps it's not clear that there's been sort of a lot of kind of emotional kind of upheaval. So the 11% is a definite kind of statistic that we have around it. It is better to not ask women about abuse in case I cause offence. Would you agree or disagree with that statement? Yeah, absolutely. We would also disagree with that statement. I think sometimes there can be a bit of anxiety around kind of talking to women about abuse, or kind of asking women around it. We would really encourage you to not kind of be frightened. If she's not being abused, she'll say no. But she certainly shouldn't kind of get upset about it. The vast majority of women tell us that there is no objection to kind of being asked. On the odd occasion that you do get women kind of who do perhaps kind of get quite cross at you asking kind of the question, generally in our experience they are victims, and they've got cross because they weren't perhaps expecting anybody to kind of ask about it, and it's more to do with their own kind of fear and anxiety around kind of disclosing. But never be afraid to ask, because that might be the one opportunity that she's had. And we know that women are desperate to be asked. We know they want to be asked. We are told repeatedly by women over and over again that they want to be asked about it, because it makes it easier for them to disclose and to share their experience. And don't be afraid to keep asking as well. If you suspect that there is domestic violence and you've asked and the woman has kind of said no, but your gut is telling you there's more to her relationship than what's kind of being left on, don't be afraid to kind of revisit the question. Obviously you don't want to kind of interrogate the poor woman, but don't be afraid to revisit it when it feels appropriate to do so, because she will eventually kind of tell you what's really going on. It just might take her a bit of time. So what do you guys think in terms of kind of thinking about barriers to sort of disclosing? So other than this issue around maybe kind of not being asked directly, what do you think might make it difficult for older women particularly to tell us that they are victims of domestic violence? Bernadette, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think it's probably an element of loyalty, fear, retribution. Where will they go? Will people believe them? What will happen to their families? Maybe if they're financially tied as well. I think all those sort of things will come into it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a really broad kind of range with barriers to sort of disclosing. And some of those are universal for all women. All women experiencing kind of violence, regardless of age, will have those feelings of shame, those questions, where am I going to go? That sense of stigma, it's definitely kind of perhaps particularly heightened in older women. And Catherine, you've mentioned in the chat about normalising abuse. I think you're right. There is an element of that, and we're going to kind of talk about that in the next kind of couple of slides about how kind of messages from society will reinforce to women that this is just kind of how life is, and this is what they have to sort of put up with now. So in terms of the abuse, the barriers, we kind of split it into different kind of sections, and one of those is sort of familial kind of barriers. Older women in particular, are often very worried about the impact on their relationships with their children. Yes, their children are more likely to be adults and no longer necessarily live with them, but that doesn't kind of mean that there aren't huge kind of difficulties that women have around that. The woman might have hidden the abuse while she was living, whilst the children were living with her. So she has a lot of concern about how talking about it is going to impact on how the children perceive her. Is she going to lose her children by telling people about what dad is really like? Sometimes the children do know what he's like because they grew up with it, they witnessed it, they were victims of it themselves. But because they aren't kind of ready to deal with their own sort of experiences, they then really struggle when their mum is now ready to kind of deal with it. You also find that when it's the child that's the abuser, so when it's the adult child doing the abusing, it makes it extremely difficult for women to kind of talk about it or to necessarily kind of do anything about it, because ultimately it's still her baby. You know, I'm sure those of you that kind of have children would kind of sort of appreciate that. You know, even when they're 25 and 30, they're still your baby. And women really struggle with that. They don't want to get their children into trouble. They don't want them to go to prison or, you know, to be ostracized from other family members. And so they'll put up with sometimes the most horrendous things, but almost, you know, for the sake of their relationship. They may worry about grandchildren, so it may we know that lots of grandparents provide care for their children. You know, they provide childcare. If she starts kind of sharing the fact that granddad is very physically violent, her children may not want the grandchildren go into the house any longer because they may worry about the grandchildren's safety. So that then limits her relationship with her own grandchildren. Again, if things become quite messy, if the adult children kind of side with the abuser, which does happen, perhaps more regularly than people might think, that can then prohibit her relationship with her grandchildren. They often feel a lot of guilt, which ties in, I think, to what quite a few of you said about feelings of shame. Guilt and shame are very kind of tied up together. And they may worry that children side with the perpetrator, which, as I said, they do. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon for that to happen. Even when children did see it, so they know exactly what it is that is going on. They may still kind of side with him. And we know that there are complex reasons why that may be the case. In terms of if you've been a victim of trauma, sometimes siding with the abuser is often a form of kind of self-protection. So it feels safer to side with him because he's less likely to then turn the abuse onto you. It's about kind of where they're at with their own sort of feelings, their own relationships with the woman and her abuser. But that doesn't really make it any better for the victim, to feel that her children or grandchildren or family members are siding with him. Particularly for older women, their health is a big kind of barrier to disclosing, because by default, because they're older, they are more likely to have kind of health related problems. Again, I never want to kind of stereotype, but statistically more likely to have it. They may be disabled to the point that they may have adapted properties. So that concern of where am I going to go is going to be worried. Where am I going to find another property that suits my needs? That has been adapted to meet my particular needs. Care needs, not unusual for us to work with older women where he is her kind of registered carer. So she worries about how she will receive that care, and who is going to provide it for her. Interestingly, it can also work the other way. So she provides the care for him, and she worries about who will care for him, who will provide his care needs. Because they often feel, older women in particular, a real sense of kind of duty towards him, that they must provide him with care, and they must kind of support him. My colleague Hazel, who is one of the Purple Project workers, was working with a woman for a very long time. They'd worked together for about 8 months. And the woman was sort of talking about how she really wanted to leave, but she was really worried about who would provide the care for him. And she had this real sense of duty that she, as his wife, needed to provide the care. And there were all kinds of things sort of wrapped up in that, in terms of what would other people think of her as his wife not providing the care, and other kind of things specific to her sort of situation. And one day, my Hazel kind of said to her, what do you think would happen if you got run over by a bus tomorrow? And she said the woman stopped and went, well, I suppose somebody would have to come in and provide the care for him. And Hazel said, well, yeah, that's exactly what would kind of happen. And she said, the woman kind of said, do you know what, I've never really thought about it like that before. And it was planting that seed for her of, you don't have to provide this care. And actually, if you weren't around, there would be other people to pick up the pieces. So that obligation that she was feeling was not a real obligation. Obviously, it felt real to her. But in terms of looking at how she could get out of the DV, it wasn't an obligation that she needed to kind of stick to. He may claim that she lacks capacity, that she has dementia. We've had this with quite a few older women that have been referred to us, where when the police have perhaps been called, he has told the police that she's got dementia, she doesn't know what she's talking about. We've had women being referred to the memory clinic on his kind of say so, and then the memory clinic have come back and said there is absolutely no problem here of any kind of description. But that makes it very difficult for women to be believed, because he can be very good at manipulating other professionals into believing that she has dementia or memory problems, or she is some way confused and not quite kind of with it. So whatever she's saying about him needs to kind of be disregarded. And I think particularly for women who perhaps, have had strokes, so like speech is very difficult, or finding words is very difficult because of that stroke. They kind of tell us that professionals become very reliant on him to speak for her. And that prevents her from telling anybody about what's really going on for her. And some of these women are experiencing really awful kind of levels of physical and sexual violence, but not getting opportunity because as the carer, everyone kind of turns to him, and sort of he speaks kind of for her. So those are some of the kind of health issues that women can sort of have. The other thing, particularly with older women, to be really mindful of is the kind of socio-cultural context in which the woman has kind of lived her relationship. We need to kind of be mindful, particularly for women in their kind of 70s, 80s, 90s, that these were women that grew up in a time where domestic violence was really not kind of spoken about. There was no legal kind of justice for them. We need to be mindful for lots of these, rape didn't become a crime in marriage until 1991. So for a lot of women, they had no justice. So their perception around what support they could get will have a significant kind of influence on them making disclosure, because it essentially feels kind of pointless. Women tell us that they feel it because she's her wife, it's kind of their duty. They talk about this concept of till death do us part, for better or worse. So really quite kind of traditional ideas that no matter what he's doing to her, she's got to stick it out because she's his wife, and that's just what you do. I've spoken to older women who have kind of talked to me about the fact that, well, marriages are hard work. That's just what they're meant to be. Which I think is quite sad that we provided women with such low kind of standards and low expectations of what married life was supposed to sort of be about. So they carry these ideas that this is just how it is, that there's no justice even if they do kind of reach out. Some of these women will have reached out in the early days and will have had very negative kind of responses back. It wasn't really until that long ago that if you phoned the police, they would sort of say to you, well, we're terribly sorry for your troubles, but because it's a domestic, we don't get involved in domestics. So the socio-cultural context silences women from coming forward and means that they then will put up with things for a lot longer than they might otherwise have done so. These are just two kind of adverts, and I'd be really interested to know what you kind of think of these adverts. So the one on the left, the black and white one, is an advert from the 1950s, and the colour advert is an advert from the 1970s. So I suppose if you sort of put yourself in the mindset of a woman living in those and growing up in those kind of eras, what kind of perspective or messaging does that give her about kind of violence and abuse Bernadette?
Sorry, it gives a message that it's acceptable, doesn't it? That patriarchal kind of society, that's acceptable to treat your female as second class and do what you want, and and for them to have to accept it, it's part of the norm.
Absolutely, 100%, 100%. I mean, you know, if you are kind of, you know, if you've been sort of, you know, hit by your husband and you want to sort of turn around and say, you can't do that to me, that's not acceptable. And then these are the sorts of adverts that you're seeing, you know, keep her where she belongs. It gives a real kind of message of you deserve, or this is what you should expect, or you certainly don't deserve any better out of it. Yeah, Julia, I would agree. I think the one on the right is very sexualized as well. I think it absolutely is a sort of both kind of accepting of violence and quite sexualized with it. And obviously, you know, this is just kind of one or two adverts, but you can kind of look this stuff up if you're sort of interested in it. Advertising and stuff is quite interesting to look at how it's kind of changed, or maybe not changed, through the ages. And these adverts really, I think, really clearly help us to kind of see about the context that women were kind of sort of living in. And yeah, and I would agree. Yeah, I think it then reinforces to the abuser that he can continue to do what he wants, because it's completely socially acceptable kind of thing to do. Yeah, absolutely, Julia. It is that kind of objectification. And there were all sorts of other kind of materials that we were sort of looking at. I mean, you know, if you go back and watch some of the old kind of films, I don't know, not you've got to kind of view them sort of their time, but kind of, you know, slapping a woman because she was hysterical was really very, very kind of accepted. You know, up until the kind of 60s, hysteria was still a kind of recognised form of madness for women. Now, so you can kind of see how women sharing their trauma, their experiences of trauma and violence, how that might have been kind of misconstrued and sort of twisted against them, which again has the result of kind of silencing, and women then feel that they just kind of have to put up and shut up effectively. Ooh. So in terms of some of the additional kind of barriers, there's issues potentially around immigration. Her leave may be dependent on him. She may not have leave to remain. Not totally unusual for us to work with women who've been in the country for a very, very long time. He was supposedly kind of sorting her visa out, but he hasn't. So she's now perhaps kind of an overstayer, or, you know, not sort of undocumented. That can obviously influence her coming forward, because she's going to worry about the consequences of that. If she doesn't speak the language, that will prohibit her capacity to kind of come forward, particularly if he is being used as the interpreter, or if family members are being used as the interpreter. So even if it's a safe person, like, you know, an adult child that's not abusing her, she's not necessarily going to want to disclose through her adult kind of child. And I'm sure lots of you don't kind of do this if you're working with women with language needs, but we do still come across a lot of professionals that don't use interpreting services. And we would really encourage you to not use family members as interpreters for anything, because we just don't know that it's safe, and we don't really know what's been kind of translated. Also linking to language, issues around kind of literacy and being able to read and write. I've worked with a couple of older women who have very limited kind of literacy skills. So, you know, they left school quite early, got married very young. Because he took control of everything, so she was never really kind of given much opportunity to kind of practice at literacy or sort of improve her literacy. And you'll be amazed at how women hide the fact that they have poor literacy skills. People's capacity to hide that they can't read and write is amazing. But that prohibits women from kind of disclosing, because they might sort of not struggle with words around it, but also because you might give them a leaflet, but she might not actually be able to read the leaflet you've given her. Or she'll worry about how she'll be perceived for not having good kind of literacy skills. Or she might be sitting there thinking, well, I can't leave him because I haven't got any literacy skills. How am I going to be independent? How am I going to kind of manage because I'm too old to learn how to read and write now? Women from the travelling community are particularly likely, older women from the travelling community, particularly likely to have difficulties around literacy. Because of how early they will have left school, and the fact that sort of education in women is not necessarily sort of promoted. She may have kind of mental health issues or alcohol issues, which can make it difficult. It clouds professionals' kind of judgment. There was a domestic homicide review, which for anyone that hasn't heard of one, domestic homicide review is a bit like a serious case review, but it's for adults rather than children. So if a woman is killed by her partner, generally you'll hold a DHR to look at what was sort of going on. And there was a DHR with a woman in her late 50s who had issues around alcohol. And what came out in the DHR was that the focus was so heavily on her drinking and the impact it was having on him as her carer, that the domestic violence got missed repeatedly, because when she tried to kind of talk about it, he was able to sort of say she doesn't really know what she's talking about, she was drunk, she can't remember. And everybody focused so heavily on the alcohol that the DV in the background, which was causing the alcoholism, got missed and kind of forgotten about. And I think particularly with older women, there's huge financial implications as well. She may jointly own the property with him. They may have joint bank accounts. Generally, you find if people have been married for kind of 30, 40 sort of years, they're much more likely to have very entwined finances, where everything is kind of linked up. So the separating of the money becomes a lot more kind of complicated than it might do for someone that's been in a relationship with someone for 2 years. You also have scenarios where I had this with a woman a couple of weeks ago, where she wasn't, she'd never been given any money by him. So until she had received her state pension, she'd never had a bank account because he completely controlled the finances. He would give her £20 maybe once every 3 months, and that's what she was expected to kind of live on. And interestingly for her, she talked about the fact her pension represented a huge amount of freedom. But part of the reason why she was kind of phoning us was that her husband had died. And whilst she was in some ways relieved that the abuse had now stopped, what she sort of talked about was the fact that because he'd kept her so dependent on him, because he'd given her such little kind of independence, she was now facing at the age of kind of 72, having to manage a house and, you know, all of the bills and sort things out that she'd never ever had to kind of think about or never been allowed to think about. And she was terrified by that prospect. It was a really kind of frightening kind of prospect for her, and she felt very incapable of sorting it, because he'd spent 40 years telling her that she was useless and rubbish and incapable and couldn't kind of do anything for herself. So in terms of kind of what women sort of want out of you as sort of professionals, they want to be asked, because they're more likely to tell us. They want to be believed, and they want that belief to be made quite explicit to them. Never underestimate the power of "I believe you" as a phrase. It is immensely kind of freeing to women to hear that, particularly for older women that have lived with this for so long. They want to be recognised as individuals. I'm sure none of you do this anyway, but that thing of not making an assumption that just because she's old she can't use a computer or doesn't know how to do this, just taking that time and that kind of professional curiosity to kind of work out what specifically she can and kind of can't do. To be given autonomy over her own life, so for her to be allowed to make her own decisions about what she wants to do, having now kind of told you that she's a victim of DV, and she wants to be given what we call space for action. So I think I mentioned at the beginning that one of the things that we've learned from our Purple Project is that older women are generally a group of women that are not looking to leave. That is not the primary end goal of support. They don't want to restart their whole lives. There's all the complicating factors that we've kind of talked about in terms of family and money and care needs and all of that kind of thing. And for her own individual reason, leaving just might not be kind of what we're looking at, and that's absolutely fine. She doesn't have to leave him. So instead, what we then want to try and do is give her what we call this space for action. So this kind of theory, this sort of concept, was created by a woman called Professor Liz Kelly, who has spent her entire kind of academic and sort of working career looking at kind of violence against women and girls, working with women affected by violence and abuse, and sort of looking at kind of, from a research perspective, how it all kind of works. And what she developed was this idea that through his abuse, the perpetrator will try and cut off a woman's capacity to kind of think for herself or do things for herself. And so what we can do as professionals is kind of look at how we can create that space for action for her, what we can do as professionals to give her back some of that. And you'll see from the kind of diagram that she has lots of different kind of aspects to a space for action. And you can use it as a physical tool if you want to when kind of working with women, or you can just use it as a tool to kind of keep in your mind about what aspects of her life you're going to try and create that space for action. And it may be difficult because ultimately you have kind of budget restrictions and difficulties around sort of the abuse, but where you can create that space for action, what it can do is massively improve the woman's quality of life. And generally that's what we have picked up older women are looking for. They're looking to improve the quality of the life that they kind of have left, rather than necessarily looking to leave and completely restart. You will get women looking to leave. It's not that it never happens, but I suppose it's helpful to really keep in your mind with older women in particular that might not be the route that you're going down, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that you've kind of failed as a professional or done something wrong as a professional. It's quite normal for that kind of age group. And and you can be quite creative in the way that you kind of do this, and the way that you kind of think about it. If she's got hobbies, or things that she sort of wants to do, can kind of carers coming in be used as a way of kind of giving her back that kind of time if it's issues around he needs kind of care, and he has a lot of sort of care needs that she's sort of meeting. You can also kind of use carers as part of safety planning. So we had a woman who carers were coming in 4 times a day, and he would always behave himself around the carers, obviously. And it was only when they went that the abuse would sort of ramp up. There was discussion about cutting the carers down to 3 times a day, but because of the level of risk that he posed towards the woman, her social worker was able to maintain the carers at 4 times a day, and that was done in order to manage the woman's safety, so that she knew she never had to go too long without somebody coming into the house. So it's just kind of thinking about what you can do, and it might not be big things. It may be that you just phone her every couple of weeks. You might be the only person that she speaks to, and you may sit and chat about what she watched on telly last night. If I'm honest, some of the women that our Purple Project workers work with, that's the kind of support they offer. It is kind of like the woman's telling what she had for her tea last night, and she's going to go and water the plants in a bit. But it's somebody checking in, and it's somebody saying, I care enough that I want to listen to you and hear what you've got to say, and I value what you have to say. And it does create space for action. It gives women that time kind of away from him, where she can kind of think about herself for a little bit, and that's monumentally kind of important. So in terms of kind of asking direct questions, I just sort of wanted to kind of ask whether how people feel around sort of asking women around sort of DV, because sometimes we know people do get kind of quite anxious about it. And do you have any sort of worries about it? Is there anything that would sort of stop you? Yes, Bernadette?
I wouldn't fear asking another female if they were being subjected to domestic violence or coercion. I think just as long as it's asked where and they're in a safe place, so a perpetrator can't hear the conversation or pick up on that, I would have absolutely no qualms in directing these matters directly.
That's good. Anyone that does have any worries? Kerry, yes.
Because I'm doing a lot of memory assessments and stuff at the moment, I'm finding it much more difficult to have any time alone with a person to be able to ask and think that I'm going to get an honest answer.
Yeah. It is difficult, and I think ultimately you can only do what you can do. Do you know what I mean? Like I think you've got to like, much as though from our perspective we'd love everybody to be asking, we've also got to have an element of kind of pragmatism about it, that it's not always kind of practical for you to sort of ask it. I mean, I suppose if you've got women that you maybe suspect that there is sort of DV kind of going on in the background, can you think in your team of any creative ways of kind of splitting up whoever that she's kind of come with? Policy is often your best friend in these scenarios, because people tend not to argue with policy, because policy is generally applied to sort of everyone. We're sort of like, right, so just so you know, as part of our assessments, we always have the patient on their own for a portion of the appointment. So I'm going to have to step outside, and you can come back later. It might not work for you, but it may work for some of you to kind of use a sort of blanket sort of policy approach. I was delivering some training to mental health staff a year or so ago, sort of pre-COVID, and they were kind of thinking about how they could get patients on their own, and they were thinking about how they could use students on placements, so that they would bring sort of the student, if they were doing like a home visit, that they would bring the student with them, and they would get the student to conduct the carers assessment with him. So not only is he then in a separate room, but he's also distracted, which then gives them time alone with her. We've had GP practices write to women and say, we're doing a Well Women event. So all patients that are female over the age of this have been invited to come for a day of, like getting weighed and your blood pressure checked and all of this. And they're very sort of clear in the letter, like this is a women's event and it's just for women. And they've got the women in kind of under that sort of guise. So it's a sort of like, it's women only, partners not required, sort of thing, and that kind of got the woman on her own. But I do appreciate sometimes it's just not possible, and I do appreciate that. I suppose if you have got suspicions or if you are kind of worried in any way, if you've not been able to get her on your own, I guess that's where communicating with each other as professionals is really important, whether that's sort of dropping an email to the social worker or GP or whoever to say, look, something didn't feel quite right. I couldn't get her on her own to ask, but could you maybe try and find opportunity for safe inquiring? So even if you haven't been able to, at least somebody else is aware, and hopefully they'll then pick up and do the asking. So I've just got a couple of kind of some questions, and just let me know whether you think they're sort of good ways of asking or kind of bad ways of asking. So I've been told I'm supposed to ask you about domestic violence. Is this happening to you? People think about that. Good. Bad. Yes, Bernadette. Did you want to say something, Bernadette, or did you just have your...
Oh, my apologies. My apologies. I think that with the way that's posed, that's not personal. Yeah. That's not sounding like it's caring about the person.
Yeah, it's quite inhuman. The other thing as well is that, particularly with older women, although if I'm honest with most women, using the term domestic violence is unlikely to get you a particularly good response, because women have a very kind of stereotypical view of DV in their heads. So she might not experience physical violence, she might experience emotional abuse. So if you use the term DV, she might go, oh no, he's never hit me. But it then doesn't acknowledge or doesn't help her to think about the 20 years of immense control, hasn't been allowed to go anywhere, do anything, see anyone, whatever. Yeah, I agree, Alison. It will close down rather than kind of opening up. You'll find that if you ask about DV in a way that is more sort of focused on behaviours, acts and behaviours, you're more likely to get a bit more out of them. Whereas if you just use the umbrella term DV or domestic abuse, women don't always identify that that's what it is that they're going through. Once they've told you, you can absolutely use that terminology and support them to recognise that's what's happening to them, and never be afraid to then say, like, well, that would be classed as abuse. But as the opener, it tends not to get you much, particularly if there's not been physical violence. So the next one, how's your relationship with your husband / partner, family? Do you feel safe at home? Yeah, some good. Yeah, it ultimately these aren't scripts, as I'm sure you're all sort of aware. But hopefully you can see with this one, it's more kind of open. It's exploring her feelings. You know, do you feel safe? It gives her more opportunity to talk about it. Sometimes women who feel the way you do so because someone at home is controlling them and making them feel unable to be themselves. Is this something that is happening in your home life? What's that one? Sorry, that one's probably a bit of a mouthful. Someone asked me to repeat it. That's fine. So sometimes women who feel the way you do so because someone at home is controlling them and making them feel unable to be themselves. Is this something that is happening in your home life? Yeah, so Alison, so people are kind of saying it broadens out the conversation. Some people think it's too broad. I don't think it is. You've got to remember coercive control covers a really broad umbrella. So it's always worth unpicking, even if you then reach a conclusion it's not abuse. But remember, coercive control by its nature is subtle acts and behaviours that can sometimes appear quite normal from the outside. Yeah, Gina, I think you're right. You may want to kind of word it differently. It is a bit of a mouthful, kind of as a question. I guess what can be helpful with thinking about this is, first of all, it kind of links to the fact that other women feel like this, so it immediately creates the idea that this isn't just something happening to her, this is something that happens to other people. So you as a professional understand that. It kind of creates that concept of like, I understand what's sort of going on kind of for you, because other women go through this sort of too. And it draws upon acts and behaviours. It draws upon feelings more than, and acts and behaviours more than that umbrella term of domestic violence. So if she's sitting there saying, well, actually, yeah, I do feel really unable to be myself because, you know, everything's always about him. You know, it's, so I worked with a woman who was in her late 50s. She'd been married to him for, I can't remember how long, brought up a couple of kids. She was watching a Panorama documentary, which is what made her realise that she was experiencing abuse. It was a Panorama documentary on coercive control. It was when coercive control came out or became a crime. And what she said to me was that it was all very subtle. You know, he didn't scream in her face. He never physically hurt her, and she knew that he would never have dreamt of kind of raising a hand to her. But she said everything was about him. And she said she realised that for the past 25, 30 years, she'd just kind of been a doormat. When they watched films, it was the films he wanted to watch. They went on holiday where he wanted to go. They ate the food that he wanted to eat. They listened to the music that he wanted to listen to. Everything was about him. And there was nothing of her. And when I kind of said to her, so what, you know, what's your favourite meal? She sort of said, I don't really know, because I don't really know who I am anymore. He's completely erased her. And it's those subtle things that are worth kind of being sort of mindful of. These more sort of broad questions help to draw out. How did that really happen? I don't believe you. Yes, very, very bad. Someone's put yes. Yeah, bad. Bad, yeah. Ultimately, yeah, you you might ask women directly, and I think I mentioned earlier, they might not be ready to disclose to you yet. But certainly saying up, well, I don't believe you, is not going to encourage kind of ongoing sort of disclosure. But they need to attend some training. They do. I would agree, absolutely. You'd be surprised at how often we still kind of hear women tell us that they get kind of asked that way. Ask if, like I say, if she doesn't say, but you still suspect, don't be afraid to gently ask again at some point in the future. She will disclose when she's ready. That's often about trust and about just needing some time to build trust in you as a professional. So this one. So you mentioned that he hit you last week. Have there been any other arguments since then? So I know you mentioned that he hit you last week. Have there been any other arguments since then? Any thoughts on that one? Yes, Bernadette?
Oh, I think that's quite a good one, because you're acknowledging what she actually said the week before, and you're also giving her a chance to open up and say if there's been anything since then as well.
Yeah. Is domestic violence an argument, though?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's not. Well, it depends, doesn't it? Because it depends if the argument started deliberately in order to keep her in a place. So I think it's to put the definition on being what the argument is.
I mean, I think an argument, everybody has arguments. No relationship is devoid of an argument, and that's okay. What's really important for us is that we're really clear with women that domestic violence is not an argument, because that's one of the tactics he uses to minimise what's going on for her. So he will use the term, it was just an argument. And he might use that term when he has, fractured her eye socket, or, made her wet herself in fear. That is not an argument. Arguments have an element of balance, whereas domestic violence, because it's about power and control, he always holds the ultimate kind of card. So Alice kind of said, don't like this, implies it's not really abuse. Jean's a bit easy for her to say no. I think you're absolutely right. It potentially can kind of end the conversation. And yeah, Alison, yeah, arguments are two-sided, abuse is not. So I think we always, professionals, want to avoid the term argument when it's not an argument. Because the reality is, within DV relationships, there can be arguments and there can be incidents of abuse, but 99% of the time, it's going to be abuse over sort of an argument. It may start off as an argument in the beginning, when he's just getting started, but it certainly, they stop becoming arguments. And no incident where somebody is hit is an argument, so it should never be kind of linked to that kind of terminology. And the very last one, I can see that there's a mark on your arm. Who did that to you? Do you need to put making an assumption? Potentially. Okay. Okay, so some people are saying maybe to reframe it as, how did that happen? So if he says to her, if anyone asks you how this happened, you say you walked into a door, and you ask her, how did that happen? What will she do? She'll say what he's told her to repeat. I appreciate it may feel a little bit uncomfortable, or it may feel a bit odd to be very direct of like, who did that to you? But if nobody did it to her, she'll tell you, nobody did it to me. When you say who did that to you, you're much more likely to get a disclosure of abuse versus asking someone how that happened. Because again, with how that happened, she's more likely to trot out the excuses that he's told her she better say when she's asked about it. In a funny way, asking someone how did that happen, or asking someone who did that to you, it almost slightly blindsides her because she's not expecting to be asked who did it to her. So she's much more likely to just tell you what went on. And I've seen this kind of in action. I did very I'll be honest, we're all learning, we all learn. When I very first started as a worker, I was caseworking, came in with a big cut on her nose, and I, without thinking, went, oh, how did that happen? And she went, oh, I fell on a chair and I had a couple in the pub. I was like, all right, didn't think anything of it. 3 weeks later, she said to me, do you want to know what really happened to my face? And I was like, yes, I do want to know what really happened. And she told me what really happened. She'd not fallen over. She'd been hit by him. And I'd worked with this woman for a very long time. A couple of months later, I saw another injury on her, and I remembered what had happened, and I said, who did that to you? And she said, who do you think did it to me? It completely changed the nature of the conversation. But I do appreciate it feels a bit funny, kind of because you think, oh, that feels very direct. But honestly, don't be afraid to do it. You're much more likely to get an honest answer. And if nobody's done it to her, she'll say, nobody, blah 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 blah, and tell you what went on. So just to sort of finish up, in terms of when if she does disclose to you and kind of how to respond, obviously believe her. Ask her what she wants to do next. Don't make assumptions about what needs to happen. Ask her, and then hopefully the two of you can come up with a plan. Be creative with your safety planning. Like I mentioned, think about how you can use other people to maximise that sort of safety plan with her. And seek support from us, from DV services. We are not expecting you, and the woman is not expecting you to have all of the answers to her kind of DV. All she wants is to be asked and to get a good response. If you're not then sure what to do next, phone us up, get her to phone us up, phone us up together. We've got a web chat if you want to kind of access the web chat. Don't be afraid to seek support from us. We do not expect, especially not after sort of just an hour, being to sort of be kind of experts in DV, in the same way that I'm not an expert in every aspect of kind of housing. So there are times when I will refer on because women deserve that proper kind of specialist support. So I appreciate it's a little bit of a whistle stop tour, but I hope it's been helpful and kind of interesting. Has anyone got any questions? Thank you. I'm glad you found it useful, Jane. So I'll sort of go through them in the order that they've kind of come. So Alison's asked, can you tell us a bit more about the Purple Project, how it's working? Yes, I can. So the Purple Project, we've got 2 workers, Adele and Hazel. They job share for 1 full-time post. So it's not a project with as much capacity as we'd kind of like. So Hazel primarily does kind of the training side of it, and she does a little bit of casework. And Adele does casework and looks after the group work project. So COVID, in terms of how COVID affected it, it obviously impacted the group work project significantly because the women could no longer, they used to come to our office to meet up, and obviously they couldn't. But we have managed to continue it on Zoom, and we've got some of the older women using Zoom, which is fabulous. The older women kind of said that I would have never learned without this. So it's kind of giving them new digital skills in addition to the support from the group work. They get a lot out of it. We call it group work, but if I'm honest, it doesn't follow like a particularly rigid structure. It's more really about kind of creating opportunities for social interaction. So if women want to disclose their experiences of DV, they can, and obviously they're in an environment where the other women kind of get it and they're going to get, you know, appropriate responses back. But it's not forced. We've got loads of kind of craft activities for them. We've got 2 older volunteers that help out with the group project. They taught a couple of the women to knit. So they knitted, the group decided they wanted to knit us a blanket, and they wanted the blanket to be given to a woman that was attending our housing hub who had a baby. The baby had a lovely blanket, which was just so sweet, just so lovely. So yeah, it has affected it, and there are a couple of women that were coming to the group work that it's not safe for them to access us through Zoom, or they just don't like it. So unfortunately, they've kind of had to wait, which is a real kind of shame. But the training we've managed to carry on, and the casework we're just doing it over telephone, and that's been okay. Women have adapted to it much better than I think any of us sort of thought they might do. And so Anne's asked if workers can support with joint visits. Unfortunately, they can't. And it's just not something that they have sort of capacity to do. But they can give you guidance and advice. In terms of like if you wanted to refer a woman into the Purple Project, the reality is because there's only 2 of them and they both work part-time, she might not kind of have capacity. So what we would encourage you to do is to get the woman to phone the helpline first, and we can basically carry her and support her until Hazel and Adele have capacity. And once they have capacity, they would then take over and provide ongoing sort of support. And if you want to kind of find out more, if you've got any sort of particular questions, or you want kind of training for your team, these are the details to access. But I think that might be everything.
Okay. Thanks, Steph. Oh, somebody, do you want to just mute yourself, Steph? I think I'm getting an echo. Thank you. I just wanted to say, Steph, thank you so much for that. And to Birmingham and Solihull Women's Aid, that was a really, really interesting presentation. Some of those case studies were really quite powerful and really kind of brought your key messages to life. So thank you for that. And I hope everyone has found that really helpful. like I said at the start, we will send out Steph's slides and some additional resources. We'll also be sharing the recording of the session, and we'll also be sending out an evaluation form, and I'd really appreciate it if as many of you as possible could complete that and send it back to us, because it's really helpful for us to get that feedback. As I said, Steph and I are just going to hang around for a couple of minutes in case anyone wants to wait behind and ask a question sort of more privately. But for the rest of you, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for engaging, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks all for coming. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much.
So there are a couple of people still here. So is there something you'd like to ask Steph? You can just unmute yourself and ask a question if you'd like, or put your hand up.
Hi, can I ask a question, please?
Yeah.
Steph, thank you first of all for this, because it's been really interesting, and particularly that information around arguing and how it's perceived. So thank you for that.
Right.
I was just wondering, because obviously as we go forward, I'm presuming that over time the Purple Project will grow and grow and grow. But I'm just wondering, kind of like if there's been any research to look at the statistics of females coming forward for the next generations, because we still know how many females are being abused and hurt. And I know that females are much more aware of what is domestic violence and coercive control. But I'm just wondering if there's been any research to kind of like show, if we're still looking at the same kind of maybe numbers in the future with what's coming through. I suppose I don't want this to sound bad against all men, but I think this patriarchal system of control, until that's broken, how are we ever going to actually break these types of cycles? I'm just wondering if there's been any kind of research into that, or if you're finding that things are improving with females' awareness.
It's a good question. I mean, so in terms of sort of the Purple Project, obviously we would love to expand it and to grow it. I mean, ultimately it's funding kind of dependent and what we can kind of get. I think it's Comic Relief that have funded the Purple Project, but if I'm not 100% sure, if I'm completely honest. But yeah, in an ideal world, we would love to have a bigger team, and hopefully we will. In terms of kind of the sort of younger sort of generation, so the statistic is that 1 in kind of 4 women will experience DV at some point during their lifetime. We estimate, and this is just sort of reported figures, that on average sort of between 1 to 1.2 million women each year experience sort of domestic violence. That's kind of statistics gathered from sort of primarily kind of police and sort of criminal justice services. So we know that that's probably a significant underestimation, because the majority of women don't sort of report. I agree with you that I don't think until we kind of remove patriarchy, we're not unfortunately going to get rid of DV. I do think that younger women's understanding of emotional abuse is maybe slightly better. So they are a bit more aware of what's kind of healthy and what isn't within a relationship. But I mean, how much it particularly sort of makes that then easier for them to come forward is probably open for debate. In terms of sort of research, I've got to be honest to say I'm not 100% hot on what all of the research kind of the primary academics are kind of looking at. But DV is not very popular because it's a women's issue. So how much people are sort of looking at reporting is probably a difficult kind of question. Reporting of DV increases year on year. We do know that. That always happens. And last year reporting shot up during lockdown.